Hey y'all, I'm Attica Scott, former Kentucky State Representative.
They're asking me about everything, local, state, federal, all the time. How do I do this? How do I do that? Why can't I get a speed hump? What's going on with the consent decree? Hey y'all, welcome to Ask Attica. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Friday morning. Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Ask Attica. I'm former State Representative Attica Scott, and this is my weekly podcast where we engage in conversations around justice and equity and fairness and so many other issues in Louisville, across Kentucky, and sometimes we bring in a national perspective. And my guest today is one of those people who's bringing us a national perspective. So we have with us today Carlton Mayers Esquire, who is a national expert in police accountability, government oversight, and community-centered safety solutions. Through Mayor's Strategic Solutions, he's been working with organizations and cities across the country to design policies that actually reduce harm, improve transparency, and hold government systems accountable to the people they serve. Here in Louisville, his work has played a crucial role in pushing for changes that move beyond performative gestures and toward real structural change. I know, because for full transparency and disclosure, we've certainly been on a few calls over the past year about the work happening here in Louisville. So today we're going to have a conversation about Carlton's work and what he's doing in Louisville with us this weekend. So welcome, Carlton.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. This is truly an honor. And just want to say it's my first time in Louisville, and it's a beautiful city.
All right. We're going to share the mic, y'all, which is what we should do in community anyway. And so glad to have you in our city. Glad that it's your first time, and we hope you will be back many times. So let's start just to give folks who are watching live on Facebook and YouTube an idea of who you are and what you bring to this conversation. Can you give us a little bit about your background?
Yes. So my name is Carlton T. Mayers II Esquire. I'm a national community development and safety expert. I've been doing this work for over 15 years now around the country. So just to give you my background, I started off as the director of the Criminal Justice Reform Program for NAACP National Offices, for the National Office for NAACP. This was back when Ben Jealous was president. After him, President Cornell William Brooks. While I was in that role, I co-authored NAACP National's Born Suspect, Ending Racial Profiling Report, was published in 2014, provides all kinds of information, historical context on racial profiling and how to end it with state and local police. After that, I transitioned to NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund Incorporated, which is Thurgood Marshall's law firm based in Washington, D.C. I was the policy counsel for the Policing Reform Campaign. While I was in that role, I worked on both the Ferguson, Missouri and Baltimore, Maryland consent decrees from negotiation through implementation, meaning from when they were negotiating the consent decree to when they even selected the independent monitor, and even afterwards when it came to enforcing compliance of the consent decree. And the work I did, I just want to emphasize at Legal Defense Fund as it related to the Baltimore and Ferguson, Missouri consent decrees, really emphasized the voices of the individuals who are highlighted in the DOJ's investigative report on pattern of practice for violation of constitutional rights. So making sure that those individuals have a voice in the consent decree process. Because I mean, I'm not sure if most people realize that when you were talking about a consent decree, typically you only have certain parties who have influence over if it's going to be terminated or not, being the judge who's presiding over the consent decree, typically a federal judge, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, and then you have the city itself. The directly impacted people actually don't have any say on what happens with the consent decree. And, kind of doesn't make sense because they're the reason why the consent decree even exists in the first place, but that's just the way it's typically set up. So the work we did at Legal Defense Fund was creating mechanisms and processes that allow those directly impacted individuals to have a voice over what's going on with the consent decree. Should we still have it? Should we not? What still needs work? Making sure that that voice is heard in addition to the city and the DOJ and the independent monitor. So I did that work for over 3 years. We did our own pattern of practice investigation of the North Charleston, South Carolina Police Department after Walter Scott's death. I don't know if anybody remembers this was back I think in 2015. African American gentleman was running away. Officer shot him in the back, and then he moved the officer's taser, toward the body of the black man that he just shot in the back while he was running away unarmed. And then he created a narrative that, oh, he grabbed for my taser and that's why I used lethal force on him. However, the officer didn't realize there was a civilian who was recording the whole situation on their camera phone. And then they provided that information to the family. So, we worked on that case. We did our own pattern of practice investigation of that police department. I also have lobbied on the Hill for federal policing reform legislation, a lot of which has now been incorporated into the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And then lastly, I did at least 5 years of work with President Barack Obama's administration when I was at both NAACP National and when I was at Legal Defense Fund on several different policing reform initiatives with the White House and with the DOJ, most notably the 21st Century Policing Task Force Report recommendations.
All right, y'all. We obviously have a powerhouse in our midst. Wow, very impressive. Appreciate the work of the Legal Defense Fund. I did some work with them over the past 5 years as well. And also want to just remind folks the power of your phone. If you heard what Carlton said about Walter Scott, someone was recording what was happening in that moment. So your phones have power. So remember that. We absolutely know that from the protests in 2020 as well, particularly with our 502 live streamers and the work that they were doing. So I want to make sure that folks know that one of the reasons you're here today, Carlton, is because Bianca Austin and Families United is having a conversation at Roots 101 this evening about public safety and the role that folks in community have around keeping one another safe. And so I just want to acknowledge that as well and appreciate you for being in town for that. So I want to go ahead and jump into the questions, if that's all right.
Yes.
Okay. So my first question for you is you've worked in cities across the country on police accountability and community-centered safety. So from your perspective, what makes Louisville's situation unique and what makes it similar to other cities struggling with police violence and lack of transparency?
So something I also want to make sure that I emphasize is the work I'm doing now with my consulting company, which ties directly into your question. And so with all that experience I have now, I have started up my own consulting company called Mayors Strategic Solutions LLC. I'm the CEO, founder, and owner of it. And what I do through the company is I advance something that I've developed called the CAP method. So that it stands for C for community empowerment, A for accountability, and T for transparency. And essentially what the CAP method, the crux of it is that community members, especially those living in zip codes, neighborhoods, and areas where you have both, or you have healthcare issues going on, you have gun violence issues, you have domestic violence issues, you have environmental issues, educational, etc. You have all of that happening at the same time as a history of negative police interactions like racial profiling, excessive use of force, etc. All of these issues are happening at the same time in these particular zip codes, blocks, and areas. How do we make sure to empower those individuals that live in those neighborhoods? Because number one, when you empower the people that are most disempowered in the community, that uplifts the whole community, right? And so if you're able to figure out how do we make sure that number one, they're involved in, number two, they have knowledge of, and number three, they have some level of decision-making authority over direct police-civilian interactions, which don't only have to do with stops and arrests and searches and surveillance technology, uses of force, and the way protests are handled, but it also has to do with how do we figure out solutions together as one community around gun violence, around food safety, around education, etc. It has to be more than just the people in the community doing it. It has to also be lawmakers. It has to also be law enforcement, private business, the media, all of those different stakeholders working together. And so what I do is I work with community on how they could develop their own mechanisms and processes locally for addressing and finding solutions on community development and safety challenges. And so how that ties into Louisville is that number one, every community is unique. Right? I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach. I think that that's impossible because every community has their own nuances, like their own cultures, their own demographics, their own histories. All of that has to be aligned with any solutions going forward when we're talking about community development and safety. And so, for instance, Louisville what happens here is going to be different than what happens in Lexington, right? Even though you're both under the same state law, at the end of the day, you have different cultures, different population demographics, different histories, and all of that has to align with whatever solutions are going to move forward. So what I do is I work with community on figuring out how do we, number one, look at what's already in our backyard when we're trying to find solutions for these issues that we can maybe rework, reorient, make it stronger. And then once we figure that out, if there's anything we don't have already, maybe there's models in other places that are national evidence-based best practices that we can then apply, custom tailor to our specific nuances like demographics, cultures, histories, and then make it our own and do it our way, right? It's not going to look the same way it did in that model, but it's going to be similar, but it's going to be our version of it. So I work with communities on doing that by providing that national subject matter expertise, by also helping them to align that with what's already in their backyard that they're maybe not seeing, or maybe they are using it, but they could maybe do it even better. So when we talk about Louisville, something that I'm doing right now through my company is I've recently published a national police decertification report card. Now, we all know that, especially over the past 5-6 years, Louisville has been in the national spotlight as it relates to community police relations, police accountability, et cetera. And there was supposed to be a consent decree, federal consent decree, that now is not going to happen, but there still is one that is going to happen on the state level that's ongoing. Plus, there's a community trust plan going forward that the mayor is spearheading. Now, one thing that I do is, with my years of experience, is that I've learned you got to be able to connect the dots on everything in order for everything to work in one community. You can't say, oh, we're going to do this and have it siloed on gun violence from the work we're doing on improving community police relations. You have to understand that they both feed into each other. If people don't trust and have confidence in law enforcement, then they're not going to pick up 911 and call them when they either hear of or see a violent crime happening in their community. What does that mean? That means that now whoever's committing that crime is now going to be out there committing more crimes, maybe even more severe, because people are not picking up the phone and calling the police because they don't trust the police are going to show up, number one, and that if they do show up, then they're not going to engage in good policing. They're not going to actually investigate. They're just going to start going after anybody and everybody who fits the description, bash heads now, ask questions later, and that's not what people want. That's not how they want to be served. So in this report card, what it focuses on is for each state, right now, ever since the protests from 5 years ago, every state except for one, Rhode Island, has a state law that allows for the decertification of law enforcement. What that means is, okay, I'm an attorney. I have a license to practice law. A doctor has a license to practice medicine. Law enforcement, they have a license to be a police officer in every state except for Rhode Island, at least as it relates to decertification. And so what does that mean, decertification? What that means is if I engage in some kind of misconduct, if it's criminal or just unethical, I can lose my license to practice law. A doctor can lose their license to practice medicine. A police officer can lose their license to be able to be a police officer in that state. So what does that mean? That means, for instance, you cannot transfer from one law enforcement agency to another without a license. You cannot arrest people and use force on people and get protections under police union contract and under U.S. Supreme Court law if you don't have a license. And so when we talk about, situations where somebody, an officer, has been found to have engaged in misconduct, if it's criminal or unethical, under Kentucky state law, especially if they've been found to have committed a felony, then they now are eligible to be decertified, meaning they get their license revoked in Kentucky to be a police officer anywhere in the state of Kentucky. Now, I don't know how many people, who are not law enforcement in Kentucky are aware that there's a law that exists that does that. But this is the kicker, and this is what makes Kentucky unique compared to most states that have a law that allows for decertification of law enforcement. Now, typically, the way it plays out when an officer is going to lose their license, it's usually the police chief or the sheriff who would be responsible for reaching out to the state entity responsible for revoking the license of law enforcement. So that state entity is typically called a Peace Officer Standards and Trainings Commission, P-O-S-T Commission. In Kentucky, it's called the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council, also known as CLEC. KLEC. Okay, that is your post commission. That is your state entity who is responsible for licensing, also known as certifying, and for decertifying, also known as revoking the license of all law enforcement in the state of Kentucky. Now, the kicker that makes Kentucky unique, and this is, goes back to your question you asked me about what makes Louisville, Kentucky unique, is the fact that your state law allows for civilians to be able to file a complaint directly with CLEC, the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council, which would then initiate the decertification process. Now, don't forget what I said earlier. Most states don't allow that. They only allow for the police chief or the sheriff to be able to file that report that would then initiate the decertification process. However, in Kentucky, the sheriff could do it, the chief could do it, and you could do it as a taxpayer, okay? And so I just want to emphasize the fact that this is not about race. This is not about gender. This is about democracy, okay? We have to understand we live in a democracy where we as a taxpayer have the ability to say, hey, my taxpayer dollars are paying for this, and that means that I have a say over how you're going to treat me. Okay, like if I go into McDonald's or if I go into a car dealership, if somebody who works there is giving me a nasty attitude, what am I going to do? I want to talk to your supervisor. Okay, I want to file a complaint. I have every right to do that. Why? Because I'm a paying customer. That's why. And we live in a capitalist, democratic society. So what that means is I'm paying for it. I have a say over how you treat me. The same thing should apply to law enforcement. Okay, if they're mistreating, if they're engaging in misconduct, then as a taxpayer, you should have the ability to say, no, you're not going to do that. The buck stops here. And the only way to do that effectively is through decertification, because like I said, once they don't have that license, they can't transfer to another law enforcement agency. They can't arrest you. They can't use force on you outside of doing a citizen's arrest, outside of claiming regular self-defense like you and I do. That's taking away a lot of power and privilege. And so the fact that Kentucky has empowered civilians as taxpayers to be able to do that, in my opinion, it makes Kentucky very unique, which then allows Louisville and even cities like Lexington to say, okay, well, since the state law allows us to do that, what can we do here locally, considering our histories, our cultures, our demographics, and create our own local mechanism so that a complaint that a civilian has about police misconduct in Louisville or in Lexington or wherever else in Kentucky can then result in an officer who has been found to have engaged in that misconduct. If it is found to be decertifiable, meaning it could be a felony or certain kinds of unethical conduct as is listed under Kentucky state law, then now you, the civilian, can file that complaint directly with CLEC to initiate that process instead of saying, hey, police chief, I need you to do it, or hey, sheriff, I need you to do it. And they can say, I'm not doing it. Guess what? You don't have to worry about the middleman anymore or middlewoman. Now you have direct contact as a taxpayer with this state entity that is paid for with taxpayer dollars. So it's just understanding there's a lot of power in that, and there's also a lot of power in knowing that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that you as a local community can use your creativity and your collaborative ability to come together and say, this is how we're going to do it for us, which is going to look different than how they're going to do it in Lexington, and look different than how they do it in other cities and localities in Kentucky, because you're all under the same state law, but your histories, demographics, and cultures are different. And in order for it to work for you, you have to make sure that difference, those nuances, demographics, cultures, and histories align with whatever local mechanism you create, so that now a local complaint can result in statewide decertification of law enforcement for misconduct.
Thank you so much for that knowledge, for that education. I hope folks heard you and took notes, right? Because I know, because I've been with constituents when I was an elected official to the police integrity unit, where individuals would file complaints, and y'all, most of the time, they never went anywhere. So it's important to know that there's a state level opportunity for folks to say, hey, listen, this officer needs to have their certification taken away. So that's very important. I wanted to ask you something. As you were speaking, it made me think about the fact that this morning you were at the bishop's table, right? Okay. So can you share with folks what that experience was like for you? And did you share this report card with folks at the bishop's table?
Yes, well, thank you for asking about that. Yes, and I was at the bishop's table actually maybe a couple hours ago. Amazing experience. I just want to say it is raining cats and dogs today, and I was shocked it was a packed house on a Friday in the rain, and it was not only community members of various backgrounds, but there was law enforcement in the room. I think there were some local lawmakers in the room, people who were running for elected positions. Just the community was really reflected in that space today, and I just want it just speaks to the work that has been happening here in Louisville, and also the level of collaboration that currently exists in this city, which you don't see that on CNN and MSN or MS Now and all those national TV networks when they're talking about Louisville. So I'm just happy to be here on the ground to experience that, and it's humbling. I just want to put that out there, and it also to me shows that there is a lot of opportunity in this city to be able to, for the community members, and when I say community, I mean everybody, lawmakers, everybody as one, to take the reins of how you want to own community safety, right? And I mean, the first step to doing that is to have that collaborative foundation, and it already exists here. So I was just really humbled by that today.
Thank you so much. All right, so Bishop, I love you, but I have not been able to make it this year because I had to make a choice. Either I take my lunch hour for my full-time job to do this podcast or to go to the Bishop's table. So we were launching something new here, so I chose the podcast. But I love you, Bishop. All right, so I'm going to ask you this next question, Carlton, and then after this, we're going to take a break. All right, so you've been pushing Louisville Metro government to adopt policies rooted in real safety, not just performative reforms. What are the biggest barriers you've seen to implementing meaningful accountability measures here, and who benefits when those reforms don't actually move forward?
Okay. And so, it's interesting because I was actually just in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a few weeks ago for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. They had their annual conference. That's an organization that brings together civilian oversight authorities, like you have an Office of Inspector General here in Louisville. You also have your own Civilian Complaint Review Board. I know Ed Harness, he's your Inspector General. So, like organizations like his own, they usually show up. And Ed was actually there. He and I spoke in Minneapolis, and so they show up to that conference to get educated on what's going on and relates to policing in America, policing reform, also when it comes to civilian oversight. So the reason I'm bringing it up is because the theme of the conference was, George Floyd protests, what's happened since then, right? Because it's been about 5 years. And there was a lot of discussion on how there's been a lot of regression, a lot of backtracking that started happening ever since 2020, but really went into full effect in 2021. And we saw that with like AT&T backtracking on Black Lives Matter, and that was a big deal. And now 5 years later, we're seeing on the federal government how we're just a lot of the good work that was put into place from the past 5 years and even decades before that are now being eroded and taken away in several different ways. And so there was a lot of discussion on how did we get here? Why did we had this huge moment or year in 2020 where, it was a huge culmination. Everybody wanted to see change. We had all these people out in the streets saying Black Lives Matter, reimagine public safety, et cetera, et cetera. And we had all these young people saying, I'm going to run for politics and I'm going to be a leader of change because I'm done with the way things are being handled. 5 years later, we really only saw maybe one or two youth that have at least been elected to Congress. One of them was Congressman Frost out of Orlando. He came out of that movement. But we didn't see really anybody else. Everybody else kind of disappeared. So there was just a lot of discussion on, well, why is that? And one thing that was, I think, a common theme, and I think this probably applies here as well in Louisville, and it definitely does in Chicago, is that the level of commitment and will coming from lawmakers, coming from foundations as well, coming from private business, especially in the local communities. There was a lot of will and commitment to do this work in the long term 5 years ago that does not exist anymore, or at least not on the same level. And why that is, I think that might vary, with every community, but at least in in Minneapolis, they were talking about how a lot of local lawmakers that make these big statements about we're doing this, we're doing that, at the same time are also undermining efforts by family members of victims of police violence and brutality, and also undermining efforts of those who want to reimagine public safety in the community behind the scenes, but out front are saying, no, we're here, we're working, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this plan. And so, there's a major contrast with the people that are actually doing the work and then those who are the decision makers. And I don't know if it's because the federal money, maybe the conditions on the money have changed with anti-DEI going on right now. Maybe that's having impact, or maybe just the fact that we had a really powerful moment where the pressure was just so immense that it was overwhelming. Local lawmakers, state lawmakers, they could not ignore it. They had to do something, and they had to come off authentic, or they were going to be in trouble come election time. And so I just think now that we're beyond that point, the pressure's not there in the same way. And I also think, and this is what was discussed as well, people on the ground are also tired. People are exhausted of doing all these protests and what comes out of it at the end of the day. And I think that what people want to see going forward are more actionable, workable, and tangible solutions that are authentic, not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's the thing is, there's a lot of, there's a perspective that one-size-fits-all approach is the best way to address these issues. And in my opinion, that's not taking in consideration the work of the community, the history of it. And if you're not doing that, you're going to get what's happened now. You're going to get people exhausted because they put all this effort into something that was not sustainable. And you're also going to have a lack of commitment because you didn't make sure that the foundation was established. You didn't make sure that all of the stakeholders had a seat at the table equally and were able to come together in a way that would work specific to them. Like a good example for Louisville, we talked about the Bishop's Table. To me, that's an opportunity, one mechanism that exists in Louisville where you already have that collaborative work happening with all those different stakeholders showing up to that Friday meeting. So now any issues we have in the community, if we're talking about how do we create a local mechanism related to the decertification report card, or if we're talking about how do we create a plan to address the state and local impacts of the federal funding cuts for the next 3 years in Louisville, as relates to SNAP benefits, Medicaid, the DOJ funding for like gun violence prevention and intervention, all that stuff is getting cut, right? So what's the plan going forward? Well, you first need a place, a safe space that everybody can come to and feel that they can be heard. And the fact that you already have that, to me, it's like, okay, there's a lot of potential here. And so the next question is, how do we take that foundation and make sure that it results in long-term, sustainable change and not a snapshot? Not, hey, we're doing this now and it looks good, everybody, look at us. And then, okay, now that the cameras are gone, back to business as usual, right? No. And I think that's where the exhaust comes into play, is that people see it happening and they know it's not like they're, ignorant to it. And they just get tired of things not changing and putting in all this time and energy and money to get the same old thing, just to get snapshot, and then we're back to business as usual. So I do think that, looking at what are ways that we can focus on not a one-size-fits-all approach, but finding out what works best for us with what we currently have, and what we don't have, how can we look to other places that have done it in a way that is authentic with the way we want to do it. And then we just kind of take from there and not copy and paste, but take from it and then custom tailor it to our nuances, our history, our culture, our demographics, so that it can now be us. We can own it and not say, well, this is what so on and so forth did and we just copy and pasted it here. That's not ownership. That's just, copying. When you own it, that's when you actually, you could take it, you can learn from it, but then you're crafting it yourself. And now you have your version of it. It's not, a copy and paste. It's not what I call the McDonaldization of social justice reform, where all we're doing is just copying and pasting a model and trying to apply it all over the country and saying this one model works no matter where it goes. That's not real. That's not realistic. I actually believe in more of what I call a Chipotle style of social justice reform, where, you come in and you get to pick what you want, right? Do you want brown rice? Do you want white rice? Do you want black beans? Do you want pinto beans? How do you want it? Do you want it in a sandwich? Do you want it in a bowl? All of that. And so that's how solutions should be developed, and that's how they should be implemented in every local community in the United States of America. It should be a Chipotle approach and not a McDonald's approach. And so, that's what I think is the number one challenge when we're talking about, how do we keep these changes in place for the long term, is that, like, right now, Louisville's focused on, okay, the alternative to the consent decree. That's great with this mayor, but what happens when you get a new mayor? He's not going to be the mayor forever. What happens when you get new city council members? They're not going to be there forever. A new police chief, that person's not going to be there forever. So how do you make sure that this stays in place regardless of that? And that kind of work, I feel like that's a different way to approach things. But the good news is that Louisville already has a safe space, already has a practice of having those kinds of discussions in a safe space on a regular basis. So that's why there's a lot, like I said earlier, there's a lot of opportunity here because of that. And so, but how you go about using it, that's the what. But the how now is the next question. Okay, now that we got the what, how do we use it in a way that we're producing the kind of solutions that work for us on all of these different issues, on the alternative to the consent decree, on gun violence, on food safety, on the schools, education, on healthcare, on environmental, right? And so that's now the question, is how do we do it for all of that? So, that's something that I think is the next challenge for Louisville.
Thank you for that, Carlton. You made me think about a couple of things. One is, folks, please pay attention to the different opportunities that are coming up for you to be part of these conversations around Louisville's version of a consent decree. There's an independent monitor that's been selected, so make sure that you're following what's happening with that independent monitor. Ed Harness has just been reappointed as our Inspector General, so make sure that you are following the work that he's doing to work to hold law enforcement accountable in our city. So we're going to take a break, y'all, and when we come back, we've got a few more questions for Carlton mayors. And we definitely hope to see y'all this evening at tonight's Families United conversation that is going to include our Inspector General, Ed Harness. All right, we'll be back in just a few.
Healthy Business Connect Us empowers families to thrive through holistic well-being, early child development, and accessible health care.
We are committed to fostering connections, knowledge sharing, and support networks that enhance the physical, mental, and emotional health of children, parents, and caregivers.
By building bridges between healthcare providers, social services organizations, educators, and families,
we aspire to create a world where every child experiences a healthy and nurturing start.
Setting the foundation for a brighter future.
Through every note, every performance, the arts connect us. The arts connect us through joy and through awe, bridging cultures and generations. From intimate theaters to the grandest stages, the arts bring us together, reminding us that we're never truly alone. When we experience the arts, we experience each other. Kentucky Performing Arts. The arts connect us.
All right, y'all, welcome back to Ask Attica with our guest, Carlton Mayers Esquire. So we're talking, of course, about police accountability and transparency in Louisville, how community can be engaged, and how we build a more healthy and safe Louisville. And we're, of course, going to be having this conversation continuing this evening at Roots 101, so we hope to see you there. So you've worked, Carlton, nationally as a policy strategist and problem solver on public safety solutions. So what lessons from other cities can Louisville learn, and what mistakes should we avoid at all costs?
Yes. I can tell you right now, I'd say about 2 years ago, I was on contract with the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was hired by the mayor's office to work with community members, the Office of Violence Prevention, the Civilian Oversight Authority, and the police department on creating what they call a citywide public safety plan that would address both crime and would also address police accountability in one plan, instead of doing them separate like most cities do, like Chicago tends to do, where Chicago focuses on gun violence when that's a big issue. All the investment and attention goes into gun violence and away from policing reform. And then when you get like an officer-involved incident on camera, now all of a sudden, now all the money and attention goes toward policing reform and away from gun violence. We said, why would we do that when they both feed into each other? Like I mentioned earlier, when people don't feel that they can pick up the phone and call police don't catch the person who's engaging in the crime, and then you get more crime happening. And so if you want to address crime, the best thing to do is for law enforcement to have that trust. And that means you have to do the work with community and figure out how do we build that trust, right, for our community. So it's important that both, anytime you're doing any kind of planning to address community safety, that you incorporate both aspects, the gun violence intervention, prevention piece, as well as the police accountability piece, because they both directly tie into each other. So that was what we did, and we worked on that for about 4 years. So the first 9 months had to do with planning, and that essentially, and the reason why I'm breaking this down to you is because I'm trying to give you an example of a national evidence-based best practice that I've actually worked on directly, just to like walk you through how they went about doing it, so that you can see not only what the CAP method, how that was reflected in the process, but also how this can be done in an authentic way to empower everybody in the community who's a stakeholder in community safety to be a part of this. So the first 9 months, we were actually working on planning things out, and that involved meeting every week, being myself, the director of civilian oversight, the police chief, the community members, including NAACP and other groups, and direct service providers. And what we would do is we would have discussions about, number one, what are we doing? Okay, why are we doing this? Okay, it's very important to have clear intention. Anytime you're doing any kind of work like this with the community, you have to be clear, because people in the community are going to criticize you. They're going to ask you questions, and you have to be prepared to answer them, okay? And they're going to ask you why you're doing this. So you better have a meeting and you're planning about, why are we doing this? Let's just lay that out and make sure we're all on the same page. So why are we doing this? And then the next question was, how are we going to do this, right? And so being cognizant of the fact that Milwaukee, Wisconsin is known to be a city of neighborhoods. And so we want to make sure that we are being respectful to each and every neighborhood. So what we did is we held 15 community listening sessions. So there's 15 aldermanic districts in Milwaukee. So we did one per district. Actually, I think there's 14 in Milwaukee. So we did one per district, and then we did an additional one just with the youth. And the reason why we did that was because we did a public safety listening session, and each one I would facilitate it. I would co-facilitate with a local facilitator. And the reason why we did that was because each district has its own nuance, their own, like I said earlier, histories, demographics, cultures, and we wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to be a part of the discussion and talk about how public safety, what the challenges are, what the solutions could be, how they can be involved in the solution, what that looks like for each district, because it's different. Some districts are predominantly white, and they have their own set of issues that are different than ones that are predominantly black and have their own set of issues. Then you have communities that are of a certain socioeconomic status, and that differs with their challenges and solutions compared to other ones. So we wanted to be respectful of that, instead of having like maybe 2 or 3 big town halls for the whole city, where not everybody's going to show up. So you're not going to get all the comprehensive information you need for comprehensive solutions. And then on top of that, it looks more like a check the box type of thing. We're just trying to make it look good, check the box, and that's it, instead of actually doing meaningful, authentic engagement with the community by going into each district and holding, we did about a 3 to 4 hour session. It would be once every other month. We did that, it spanned over 2.5 years to do every district. And then we did one with just the youth, because the youth, that they came up in every single listening session as a challenge. Everybody did, but the problem was that there were no youth in the audience. So their voice was not being reflected and being included in any kind of data collection we're getting through these conversations. So when we're talking about putting together a citywide safety plan, if the people who are most directly impacted are not a part of that process, then that means that's going to be reflected in whatever's produced from that process, being the safety plan, is not going to incorporate the youth voice and youth solutions. So we said, okay, how do we get around that? Because we're seeing this coming up. We've had like 5 sessions now. What's going on? 8 sessions. Okay, let's put together just a youth event. Now, this is the thing. To do that, you want to make sure the youth show up. Something we learned is that youth are not going to show up at an event unless you do it someplace where they're already at. Because we tried to do it at schools. They wouldn't show up. All right. So we ended up doing it at a youth center for at-risk youth. And you know what else? Youth will definitely show up when you got free food. So we got about, I don't know, it seemed like maybe 15 or 20 boxes of pizza. Different kinds, pepperoni, cheese, all of that. And of course, they're going to see the food and come over where the food is. And then while they're getting the slice, hey, why don't you join this conversation? And they had a beautiful space in there, round table setting, everything. So we ended up having youth, black, white, some were LGBTQ plus, et cetera, all in the space sitting in a round table setting next to Milwaukee Police Department officers and deputy chiefs. And they were able to, using the CAP method and using interactive technology, meaning we're using our cell phones, our laptops, we're using our tablets instead of using easel board and chalk paper to have these discussions. And you know, young people, that's how they communicate anyway. All right, you can't even have a discussion with them in person because they're on their phone. They're like, hey, you want to talk to me? Text me, all right? Like, or DM me or whatever, a Snapchat or what, you know? So that's even how a lot of parents communicate with their kids because that's how these youth communicate. So we were like, why are we asking them to come to the conversation instead of bringing the conversation to them? Let's go to the phone. Let's bring the conversation to the phone, to the laptop, to the tablet. So we did that using interactive technology. And by doing that, pizza, having it at the youth center, using the cell phones as interactive technology, now the youth are fully engaged. And guess what happened? A lot of stuff came to the surface about the way that Milwaukee PD has been engaging with black youth, especially black LGBTQ youth. And it got really tense, okay? And that's not a bad thing, okay? You need conflict in order to get resolution. You gotta bring things to the surface, gotta rock that boat in order to bring about change. And so this is where, like I said, the CAP method, this is how it operates. We're going to get everybody in there. Everybody has equal power. Everybody's in a safe space to be honest and candid. And we're using the phones, so that allows you to be even more candid. And now we're hearing things. We're hearing stories when the responses come up on the screen. You know, we don't see who gives the response. It's all anonymous because of the technology, but you see the response, and that generates discussion. Now we're talking about issues, and people are saying, yeah, that's me. I put that up there, and this is my story. And then you have the deputy chief saying, well, no, that's not how we do things. And it gets tense. And me as a facilitator, I've also been a mediator as well. I'm a trained mediator. I now are saying, okay, let's look beyond what's being said on the surface and let's see what's really going on. So you're saying that this is what you think, and you're saying that's what you think. You know what? You realize that both of y'all are saying the same thing. When you bring that level of realization to the discussion, that's something that people are not seeing because they're so big on what they're trying to get across and being right, that they're not listening to what the other party or person is saying and understanding, wait a minute, we're both saying the same thing. And that's why it's good to have these kind of discussions with the facilitator who's local and one who's from the outside, because then you don't have the baggage of somebody local who, oh, we know you, we don't like you because blah, blah, blah. But you also don't have people saying, oh, why are you investing money on outside people and not also on inside people, right? You do both, so that you can bring up those kind of nuances. And when they come up in the community, oh, maybe the outside person doesn't know about that history, but the one who is from there does and can bring that nuance to discussion. And now we're able to bring everything full circle and have some resolution. So I'll tell you this, it got kind of, you know, back and forth with the youth and law enforcement. By the end of the full session, after everybody was able to talk it out, get all those responses on the screen, what happens? I didn't tell them to do this. I'm gonna put that out there right now. Those same youth respectfully go over to law enforcement and continue the conversation without me or anybody else saying you have to do that, without there being any pizza there or any desserts or anything to say, oh, well, if you do this, then you get that. This is on their own. And the police on their own being receptive to that and also in a respectful way, continuing the conversation. That's how you build community. You have to go through the rough spots and you have to figure out where can we come together, because this is our community and we have to own it. And that's what owning it looks like. You have to learn how to work with people that don't come from the same lived experience as you, but you're all living in the same community, dealing with the same challenges. So, you know, that's just giving you an example of how we did it in Milwaukee that worked for Milwaukee. I'm not saying that will work in Madison, Wisconsin, which is still under the same state and all, but it's a different community, different dynamics, different history, demographics, et cetera. But for Milwaukee, this is how they chose to utilize the CAP method in a way that was authentic for them. so they could own the citywide safety plan once it was produced, because now we've incorporated everybody in the process to own it. So whatever comes out of the process, we own it, and we're going to move on that. And so that's one example. Another example, just to bring up, is, and this is what we were actually basing the work we did in Milwaukee on, was Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, Cincinnati, Ohio, I don't know if you know this, they were under consent decree. I think maybe about 10 years. This was like since 2004, I think. They're not under consent decree anymore. It's been terminated for longer than 10 years, and I think, yeah, it's been a while. But when they were under consent decree, what they did in Cincinnati, which is something that, in my opinion, is a good model, not a model in that you copy and paste it, but a model in that you look at, okay, that's a good idea. How do we do something like that for us? Is that they didn't wait until the consent decree was terminated to say, okay, how do we put together a plan on making sure that the reforms in the consent decree stay in place even after the consent decree is terminated and there's no more federal oversight. They said, no, we're working on this now. Before we finish it up, we're going to put that plan together while the consent decree is in place, so that when it's done, we still have this plan that was made by the community and owned by the community. And so we're going to make sure we keep it going. We own that, not the DOJ, not the federal judge. We do. It's our community. And so what they created was the CCA, the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement. I know that President Barack Obama, I think it was in 2005, I could be wrong on that date, but when he was president, he had, during a press conference, he talked about the the Cincinnati Community Collaborative Agreement. He said that it's a model for community policing for the country, you know. So, and I do agree with him on that. And the reason being is that what they did is they brought together the police union, the police department, the mayor's office, community advocates, including NAACP, direct service providers, and they said, and victims of police brutality and their families. And they said, okay, what is it in the consent decree that we want to make sure is written up in an agreement that we can all then codify and then make into law, right? And then what is not in the consent decree that we want in there, right? That might tie into maybe gun violence or other issues and in crisis due to mental health and substance abuse, et cetera. And so they said, okay, now we're going to put this together. And they had a lot of back and forths and disagreements. But like I said, that's not a bad thing. You need to do that to get things to the surface and find resolution and transform the situation. So that's what they did. And ultimately, they came out with the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement. Now, what they did as well, which is unique, you see, in Milwaukee, what we did is, in Milwaukee, they created a citywide public safety plan, which is then going to be codified into either an ordinance or a municipal charter amendment, so that now it's law and it stays in place for the long term, no matter who's mayor, no matter who's in the police chief, no matter anything. That's it. What they did in Cincinnati is they said, well, there's certain pieces of this that we can codify through the municipal charter amendment. There's other pieces of it we're going to have to codify through local ordinance. And there's other pieces of it we're going to have to codify through an MOU, right?
Which is?
A memorandum of understanding. And so that's essentially like a contract where the parties involved all agree that going forward, this is how we're going to engage. This is what that looks like. This is how that's going to play out. And it's not binding like a contract. So it's not like, oh, well, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you're in breach of it, then we can go to court and sue you. It's really more about confidence and trust amongst all the parties and saying that I trust that you're going to do this. And if you don't, well, then now you break that trust, and going forward, we'll see how that plays out. So it's everybody relying on trust rather than on the law to be able to enforce it, right? And so, but sometimes you have to do that. And that's not a bad thing, because you're better off doing something than doing nothing, okay? Trust me on that. You're much better off doing something than nothing. Because if you don't do anything, then guess what? There's no investment in it. There's no attention to it, and therefore it's not going to happen. You have to make a case for things. In order to make a case, you got to have action. Action then produces the case and the justification to keep it going. So you got to do stuff. And so, yeah, they did that in Cincinnati, and now it's been over 20 years that the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement has been in place. Their consent decree was only in place for 10 years. The Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement that is homegrown, all right, and owned by the community has outlasted the consent decree that they were under by over a decade at this point, okay? And they learned what you have to do, and you're able to do that when you own something as a community. How do you adapt to changing situations like COVID, That changed everything for everybody. How do we operate? How do we still make sure these things are moving? Well, we already have a mechanism to come together, share in a safe space. Let's utilize that. And so that's what they did. Now we have the federal government cutting back on public safety nets and public assistance, right? And funding. So, okay, now that's a whole new environment. How do we adapt to that? So the CCA, the way it's structured, it allows them to be able to come together as stakeholders and meet on a regular basis, talk about this stuff, come up with decisions together through a process that they've agreed upon, and now we talk to the larger community about it, get that input, and now we move forward. And so it's just, like I said, like I mentioned, Milwaukee, they had their way of doing it. Cincinnati had their way, and there's other communities as well. I just wanted to give 2 examples. But the whole point is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, all right? It has to be custom tailored for every community in order for it to work. And the whole point is you don't want to do snapshot work, all right? You don't want to do what I call lipstick, right? So it's something you put on, it looks good, but it has no substance, right? You want to do something that's meaningful and that lasts, sustainable over the long term. In order to do that, people in the community have to feel like they own it, all right? If people don't feel like they own something, they don't care about it. I'm just gonna give one last example real quick. Okay. So for instance, when you look at diversion programs for youth who engage in, misconduct, whatever, they get in trouble. Instead of locking them up, we're gonna divert them into a program where they can maybe restorative justice, they can learn a different way, accountability rather than being locked up, right? Well, one way that a lot of groups, I've done a lot of restorative justice work with youth. One way that the work I've done with youth has been, how do we get them to care about the community that they live in? And one way you could do that is, for instance, you have graffiti up, painted on walls. Well, guess what? You get those youth to paint over it and maybe even come together to create either a green space or their own mural, something that they can feel ownership of, so that now every time they pass by that space, they have a sense of pride. They have a sense of, yeah, I was a part of that, I did that. And guess what? When people have that sense of pride, then they also care about other people not messing it up. So when somebody else is trying to, hey, don't do that, man, all right? We put a lot of work into that, and we own it. So don't do that. That's, in my opinion, another challenge that's missing from a lot of the work that came out of the protests from 5 years ago. We got a lot of snapshot, a lot of people saying, yeah, we're going to do this, and then years later, they ended up not doing it. Rather than saying, we're doing this is how we're going to do it, we're going to stay in it for the long term, and we're going to make sure that the way we do it, that people own the work so that they stay committed to it. So, I just want to emphasize that's one example of how that's already playing out with youth. When you get them to own those kinds of projects, then they are like, yeah, I'm not going to mess this up. I'm not going to let anybody else mess it up. So, it's the same thing when we're talking about having community come together and come up with long-term solutions. If you want them to stay engaged, they have to feel like, I own this. Like, this is a part of what I want and a part of me. And if they don't have that, then that's, I think, where you see the fall off, you see the exhaustion, and then you have a lack of commitment. And that's when the work doesn't move forward on a sustainable way.
I appreciate you, Carlton, for sharing those examples with us, because listen, folks, Cincinnati's up the street. So we need to go to Cincinnati to see what they've done with their CCCA, then we need to get on the road and make that happen. I also appreciate you bringing up making sure that people, including young folks and our elders, having to be intergenerational and multi-generational, are involved in projects to strengthen and bring about community safety, public safety, health, everything, public health, all of it. So, for example, we're going to take a break after this. When I served on Louisville Metro Council, we made a commitment to 28th Street and 32nd Street in the part of the neighborhood after the shooting on 32nd Street. We had the beautiful Phoenix mural that Ramona Dalla put to me, 150 people helped to paint that mural on an apartment building. Young folks from the neighborhood helped to make it happen, and it was not touched. Nobody ever touched that building. Same thing on 38th Street. When I graduated, we had the wall. It's still up, y'all. So, the folks graduated from middle school. Community garden, same thing, multi-generational community garden where folks are coming to learn how to grow their own herbs and fruits and vegetables in a place that they help to build. So you're exactly right. When people are a part of creating, they feel that sense of ownership. So thank you so much again for that, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
Never in my career as a lawyer.
The following is a pre-recorded broadcast brought to you live for the purpose of live discussion.
Hey guys, before we get back to the live stream, I'm Tracy, the bartender at Southern Hospitality Bar and Grill, located at 3402 West Broadway. You guys got to come and check us out. You can call your order in, and the phone number is 502-822-1474. Again, I'm Tracy, the bartender at Southern Hospitality. Come check us out, guys.
Healthy Business Connect Us empowers families to thrive through holistic well-being, early child development, and accessible health care.
We are committed to fostering connections, knowledge sharing, and support networks that enhance the physical, mental, and emotional health of children, parents, and caregivers.
By building bridges between healthcare providers, social services organizations, educators, and families,
we aspire to create a world where every child experiences a healthy and nurturing start.
Setting the foundation for a brighter future.
All right, y'all, welcome back to Ask Attica with our guest, Carlton Mayers, Esquire. And we are talking what's been happening in other parts of the country that we can learn from. So I've got my next question for you, Carlton. So you talk a lot about solutions that actually reduce harm rather than deepen surveillance and punishment. What practical strategies should Louisville be investing in right now if we truly want safe, healthy, and thriving neighborhoods?
Okay, there's, in my opinion, right now, there's three things that Louisville should focus on. And this is based on the current environment when we're considering what's going on not only here in Louisville and Kentucky, but also the federal government, the globe, national trends, what's happening in other communities, what they're working on, et cetera. And then also the fact that the consent decree, how that whole process was supposed to happen a certain way, and now you're going in a different direction. So one of them is what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is the National Police Decertification Report Card. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because, and this is for every city around the country, if it's Ferguson, if it's Baltimore, Chicago, everybody who's under a consent decree, and also everybody who's not under a consent decree. In order for you to have true police accountability, meaning in order to make sure that law enforcement are not going to engage in misconduct going forward, we have to understand that going after them criminally, I'm not saying not to do it, but it's limited, okay? Number one, it's really hard to get an officer indicted, meaning that the prosecutor has to make a case against them. Good luck on that. Number two, even if that does happen, good luck on getting a jury to be able to, come out with a verdict against the officer. It's really hard to do that. And even if you get that, it's also really difficult to make sure the judge, gives a sentence that matches the offense. A lot of times, judges will either put an officer on home confinement, probation, or give them reduced time locked up in prison, okay? They don't get the same kind of time that a civilian would get for committing the same act, okay? So, criminal charges can be very challenging because of that. And then civil, I know there was a big push for getting rid of qualified immunity 5 years ago, which is a way that law enforcement can raise a defense in court so that way they're not liable for money damages, meaning that you can't sue them for money because they engaged in misconduct. And so because they raise qualified immunity as a defense, the same way that you could say, oh, you can't sue me because I have this law that protects me, right? So because of that, it's really hard to sue them for violating constitutional rights, and even to get a court that would agree to that in general. And then when we're talking about firing, terminating officers, there's also challenges with that. Number one, try to get them fired. That could be a challenge. And even if you do get them fired, they have the right under police union contract to file a grievance through arbitration, so that now they can go to an arbiter who usually favors law enforcement and will probably reverse the firing, reverse the termination of employment, allow the officer to get their job back, so now they get their pension and they get whatever back pay that they missed out on. And then what they usually do at that point is they'll quit, and then they'll go to another police department. And then they'll go back on pension, go back on the pay, and then engage in misconduct, okay? We talked about that already earlier with decertification. And I know that that's already happened in Louisville, that specific scenario. So it's very important that understanding, okay, we look at criminal, we look at civil, we look at firing. All of these have been utilized and have not worked for long-term change when it comes to police accountability. So what needs to happen, in my opinion, is continue to pull those levers for criminal, civil, and for firing. But in addition to that, pull this additional lever for taking away their license, revoking that license, decertify them, because that, to me, that is the best way to make sure that the buck stops here. You're not going to victimize, you're not going to harass or bother anybody else or any other family member, because you don't have the ability to. You're not able to be a police officer in this state ever again. Take away that license, and they can't do that. And so I think that as Louisville is moving forward on this alternative to the consent decree, police accountability is a big part of that, right? That's why that DOJ did their investigative report, and that's why they said you need to have this consent decree, okay? And so in order to make sure that that happens, now that the DOJ is not involved anymore, the federal government's not involved, you have to rely on state law, and you have to rely on local law and efforts. And that's where decertification comes into play, because you do have a state law in Kentucky that allows you to decertify officers. And even better, you have one of the most empowering state laws in the country, because your state law allows people like you, taxpayers, civilians who are not law enforcement, who are not a police chief or a sheriff, to file a complaint directly with the state entity that's responsible for decertifying law enforcement, which is CLEC, the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council. So that now gives you power to be directly involved and say, okay, we can now have a seat at the table, and then we can also track what's going on with these cases. And then if we need to hold CLEC accountable, because we believe that CLEC is not doing what they're supposed to do, they're not decertifying officers who have been found to have engaged in decertifiable conduct under Kentucky state law, well, then now that's another path for advocacy, right? It's not only advocacy on, okay, on the ground, how do we create our own local mechanism so that a local complaint about an officer engaging in misconduct in Louisville can result in them statewide losing their license to be a police officer in the state of Kentucky. But now we have some more work to do with CLEC, because maybe CLEC is not decertifying officers that they're supposed to be decertifying. So what can we do with our own advocacy efforts on the administrative level to say, okay, we're going to show up to CLEC standing meetings, which they have once every 3 months, so that's 4 times of the year, that you as a taxpayer have a bite at the apple under state law and under CLEC's administrative or under their bylaws to show up, find out what's going on with my taxpayer dollars, and then provide public comment on the record. That's very important. That's what makes us a democracy, on the record. That means that you can now use that in the future when it comes time for elections. Hey, state lawmaker, this is what was said, this is what was done. It's your responsibility to do something about this. You want to get reelected? You want me to support you? Get it done. Because the same power I have to vote you in, I can also vote you out. Okay? And we have to understand the power that we have in a democracy and use it, and use the state law rather than the federal. Okay? We're going to put that aside for now. Use the state law to now move forward on this issue. And I think because Louisville is trying to come up with this plan and this alternative, this lends a unique opportunity for you to say, well, what can we do with our state law that we can incorporate into this alternative that would make us unique for us, that we can own for us? And I think this is one thing you could do in addition to the other work you're doing that's going to make it stronger and make it more solid, and also make it something you can own as a community for the long term, rather than have it be like lipstick, have it be a snapshot. Oh yeah, this looks really good, we're doing it now, but then 5 years down the line, oh, what's going on? Oh, well, not really much. Okay, no. We're able to decertify, so we're always going to have something happening. And if CLEC is not doing what they're supposed to do, well, guess what? We have an Office of Inspector General. They can do an audit on CLEC as well, because they can audit the complaints that they file with CLEC. Okay? And they can say, okay, I filed it. This is what happened with it. Now I'm going to publish that in an annual report that now the media gets, And the media can now say, oh, look, let's put out a story on this. That gets national attention. The pressure. Oh, man, it's starting to feel like 2020 again. The pressure. What do we do? The mayor, local lawmakers, state lawmakers, law enforcement. The pressure. This is how you build campaigns. This is how you bring about change. Okay, you got to start somewhere. You don't do nothing. You got to do something. So what I'm saying is you have one way with your local advocacy to create that local mechanism. You have another way with the administrative advocacy with CLEC to say, hey, CLEC, we've been filing these complaints. What's going on? We're not seeing anything. What's going on? Okay, we got to do some work on you. We're going to show up to your meetings. We're going to get that on the record. We're going to go to our state lawmakers. We're going to get that on the record. We're going to get our local lawmakers to say something about it, get the media. We're going to build a campaign. And then your other thing you're going to have to do, you're going to have to do some state legislative advocacy, okay? Because one thing, and this is highlighted in the report card I'm going to talk about later today, is that unlike other states, some of them are less empowering than Kentucky. Other ones are more empowering with their state law to allow community members to be engaged in the decertification process. Kentucky does not allow, or does not, let's say it like this, CLEC does not provide on their website any information to the public about ongoing investigations of officers who are being accused of engaging in misconduct for decertification. So in other words, when CLEC is doing their investigation of an officer for decertification, they don't post that on their website. This is an ongoing investigation. And so there's no open database, there's no integrity report that they publish once a month or once every other month like other states do, okay? The other thing that they don't do, and to me, this is really egregious. Okay? CLEC does not publish on their website the final results of the decertification process. So in other words, if you filed a complaint as a community member, I mean, they might get back to you about it, but they're not going to put that on their website. This officer has been decertified, right? Like, I don't understand why they don't do that, because this is your taxpayer dollars paying for this, paying for that officer. So if they've engaged in misconduct and you have found as a state entity that is responsible for decertifying them that we are decertifying you, why isn't that posted on your website and listed so that people in the community can go to your website? Okay, I want to find out what's going on with officers in my community. You know, has anybody been decertified? Or who's coming into my community? Were they maybe decertified at another police department in Kentucky? There's no way to, as a taxpayer, to be able to look that up, which means the only way you can get that information is through a public records request. And I can tell you right now, I've done a lot of public records requests. I actually have a training that I do nationally where I educate community members on how to use their state law, on how to draft and manage the public records requests for themselves. I can tell you right now, if you submit a public records request, number one, they may not give you the information that you're requesting. Number two, if they do give the information, they're going to redact, block out a lot of stuff, so you're not even going to get everything you want. And then number three, and this is the most important part for you to understand, it might cost too much money for you to even afford to get the information. Because you have to understand, anytime you put in a public records request, they're going to charge you for the administrative costs to be able to generate whatever information you want. If they have to print out stuff, they have to have time and energy to redact certain information in it, that's money. And they're going to charge you, the person that requests the information, for that. And if you can't pay it, then you don't get the information, okay? So, and this is why a lot of times journalists, they have a budget for public records requests when they do their investigative journalism, so that way they can have the money to pay for that information that they need to come out with the story, okay? But a regular community member, I'm sorry, typically does not have that kind of budget, okay? So, understand that this is why it's important that you do see, you don't only have the local grassroots advocacy and the CLEC administrative advocacy, but you also got some work to do with your state lawmakers, with state legislative advocacy, to do what other states have done, like Illinois, I want to say Indiana, for instance. And Indiana is a really good example. They're your next door neighbor, so I'll bring them up. I actually worked with state lawmakers in Indiana in 2020 on their decertification law that was enacted in 2021. And they have one of the strongest laws in the country. Why? Indiana actually posts, and I looked at it recently, their CLEC counterpart posts on a regular basis a list of all officers that have been decertified in the state of Indiana. And they update it. They update it on a regular basis, okay? So This is done by another red state who's your next door neighbor. This is not, no, not necessarily a red state, a Republican majority run state, okay? So this is not a political thing. This is about professionalism. This is about safety. This is about democracy and making sure that we adhere to the principles of it, being a taxpayer. And states like Indiana, they get that. And so they make sure that those kinds of laws exist on the books so that you, the taxpayer, are living in a democracy where you're able to easily access that information without having to go through a public records request, without having to spend any money or deal with any back and forth with whoever you're trying to get the information from. It's just you go to the website, you look it up, okay, boom. I see that so and so forth got decertified or so and so forth did not. Okay, cool. Now I have that information. I can now do what I need to do with it. I'm a taxpayer. Thank you, the state of Kentucky, right? That's not happening. And in order for that to happen, it's going to require state legislative advocacy. So I know I just said a lot, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what I'll be talking about tonight, just to kind of give you some forward-looking things to do and how this report card and the information in it can not only be incorporated into just your individual work, but also can be incorporated into your work for the alternative to the consent decree, right? Because you want to make sure it's something sustainable, that's for the long term, and that you as a community can own. And so this is how you can do it, doing that local advocacy, the administrative advocacy, and then that state legislative advocacy, all of that.
Listen, Carlton, you're talking my language. So especially when we talk about state level advocacy, y'all, I was like, what? Oh, say more, say more. So please be sure to follow Stay Live Streams. Make sure that you share this particular podcast, because what we're going to do afterwards is follow up and provide information to you about CLEC's quarterly meetings so that you can show up at those quarterly meetings. Even if you're not showing up to speak, it's important to know what's going on and how decisions are being made. So, and that legislative work, y'all, next year, 2026, is an election year. So all 100 members of the Kentucky House are up, and half of the 38 members of the Senate are up for election, or those seats are up. So make sure that you are paying attention to those campaigns. And if you are hosting any kind of community forum, debate, anything like that, you need to be incorporating these kinds of questions into those community forums, into those debates, into those questionnaires. Never let anyone off the hook, even your favorite legislator. Do not let them off the hook. Everyone needs to be held accountable, and everyone needs to be an advocate for transparency. Now, we didn't get too much into the report card because you got to have a reason to show up at Roots 101 today. So make sure that you show up, because that's where we'll dig more into the report card. So last couple of questions for you, Carlton, before we go. So trust between communities, particularly Black communities, and law enforcement in Louisville is deeply fractured. You've referenced that already. What does real trust building look like to you and in your experience? And what role do folks like the folks we see here in Goodwill have in holding systems accountable?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So what it looks like to me is a good example right now is, and I know every community around the country is dealing with this. How do we handle the state and local impacts of the federal funding cuts, right? Because those cuts are not only related to SNAP and Medicaid and public education funding, it also ties into funding from the Department of Justice to go towards gun violence intervention and prevention. A lot of that money that states receive to do like gun violence intervention and prevention work, that comes from the federal government's DOJ. And a lot of times they'll send that money to your either police department or to your state or local government, and then they will pass through, they call that pass-through funds, where then they will take that money and give it to you and say it's coming from the state or from the local government. But the reality is that it's the federal money that's paying for it, okay? That money is not coming anymore, all right? So, this new administration has already said that. They've already put that out there. And the money has already been has not come through for this year for a lot of municipalities around the country. So already communities and even when we talk about like renewable energy and environmental work, there was a lot of money that was supposed to come from the EPA towards that. That's not happening anymore. So there's a lot of communities that right now are trying to figure out, okay, what do we do going forward? Because this touches on every aspect of our community. And when we talk about public safety, this is something that came up in discussions that I had in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is that ever since 2020, people don't see public safety as just law enforcement and gun violence. They see it as broader than that. They see it as having, a clean neighborhood, right? Because they know that when the neighborhood is not clean, it looks like it's neglected, then that means people that want to commit crime, more than likely they'll commit crime in that neighborhood because it looks like people are not paying attention. They want to have well-lit street lamps, right? Because when you don't have a well-lit street lamp, then people who want to commit something that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to go to that area because it's not going to be hard for you to see me, right? So there are other things that can happen that have nothing to do with law enforcement that can still provide you with public safety and community safety. And it's much broader, right? Even environmental, healthcare, education, all of that stuff ties into safety. So when we're seeing these federal funding cuts to the public safety nets and to public assistance, that's going to have a massive impact on public safety and community safety, all right? And so how do we, in my opinion, try to come together now and start planning for that? So something I've done is I've created a one-pager, call it a one-pager checklist, and it's on my website, and I know you'll have the information on before we end, where you can go to my website. Just understand everything I talk about and everything I do, the report cards and the one-pager, etc., all of that stuff is free. I'm emphasize it, free on my website. All you need to do is register with it. That means just give me your email, that's it. I add you the email listserv so you get my newsletter and all that, and that's it. Then you get access to all this information for free, okay? So I'm gonna put that out there. But there's a one-pager I have on the website, on the resource website, webpage, where what it does is it asks you a series of questions, I'd say maybe about 6 questions, that will take you anywhere from an hour to 4 hours, and I encourage you to bring together all of the community safety stakeholders into this conversation as you run through these questions. Now, what the questions are going to do is it's going to help you create what I call a scenario plan. Really is a worst-case scenario plan that will help you navigate. What do we do knowing that certain direct service providers, certain community-based organizations, certain faith-based organizations who are meeting the needs of people in our community or who are relying on federal funds, we know that they have not been getting money, and they're probably going to get even less or no money going forward for the next 3 years. 3 years to deal with it. What's the plan? What's the plan for the next 6 months on how we're going to do it? What's the plan for the next 12 months, 18 months, 36 months, right? And really looking at, for instance, how much money did that organization get from the federal government in fiscal year 2024? This year, less. Next year, maybe nothing. How do we then fill in that gap, right? Where there's no federal funding coming in. Do we have local, state, private money that we can lean on and maybe work, bring it together and figure it out? Or maybe we don't have any money. Maybe we can do this at no cost by just reorienting the way that our community-based direct service providers are meeting the needs of people in the community so that they do it different at no cost, and we're still able to meet those needs even with no federal money coming in. And then maybe we can't do that. And if we can't do that, then how do we prepare for the inevitable? Okay, the inevitable being that at this point we already know, because there's been more than enough studies done that have shown that when people's needs are not met in the community, there's a much higher likelihood that they're going to engage in crime. And when they engage in crime, public safety goes down and crime goes up. So how do you prepare for the inevitable, meaning for crime to go up and public safety to go down? I mean, in pretty much all cities at this point, this is not their first rodeo. And so they've already been there and done that, so they might even know who might be the one to pop off in the community because their needs are not being met, or at least know what zip code or block or area in the community might pop off because their needs are not being met. So how do we prepare for that, and how do we address it knowing we're walking into this for the next 3 years? That's the whole point of it, is how do we do that in a way, in a structured fashion? And that's something that I have on my website. I also offer a teach-in where I can run through the one-pager with you. It can be done virtually, hybrid, or in person. And so that way I educate you on how to use it. And then if you want, you could also have a workshop I do where I can actually come to your community, or we can do it virtually, and we'll use interactive technology to build out the plan. So that would take us to like 4 hours typically. We'll use interactive technology to use our cell phones, laptops, and tablets instead of using paper and chalkboard to come together, making it more accessible because you can do it from your home. While you're driving your car, you can participate in the event. You don't have to be there in person. And it also allows you to submit answers anonymously. So that way you don't have to feel like, oh, well, I don't want my neighbor to know my opinion. Our kids go to the same school and it can be awkward. We go to the same church. You don't have to worry about that. Everybody sees the answers. They don't know who submits it. So it allows you to be more candid. When you're more candid, we get more information. We get more solutions. Because what I believe, and I've seen this from the work I've done over 15 years across the country, everybody in the community has a piece of the answer. Everybody in the community has a piece of the solution. And so if we're not incorporating, we're not allowing people to come in and give it, then we're not getting it, and that's how we stay stuck. Okay, and so being able to have a process that does that, and using your phone, will now allow people in Louisville, in my opinion, to be able to talk about these issues. What's going on with SNAP and the food pantries? What's going on with Medicaid and people's premiums going up, right? What's going on with the public school education and, with IEPs, et cetera, right? I mean, there's a lot there that needs to be fleshed out, but we need to do it in a way that we're coming up with tangible, actionable, and workable solutions. Not something that just looks good, but there's no substance, like lipstick, right? Like we need something that actually has substance for the long term. So that's what I've been doing, is working with communities on walking them through the one-pager, and then coming up with some collaborative workshops so that now they can, in one day, not over a series of days, in one day, we meet. After 4 or 5 hours, we have all that data that has now been generated using this interactive technology tool. Once you're done with the session, immediately you get all that information on an Excel spreadsheet and you get it on PDF slides. The good thing about having it on an Excel spreadsheet is that you can then copy and paste that information onto a Word document or PowerPoint. So now you can use it in different ways in your community. So the whole point is you do this event, you have a plan, and now you can move on it yesterday. Rather than, okay, we know that stuff is falling apart, we know the house is burning, but we'll just wait and see what happens. I mean, hey, you can do that. Me personally, I think that's more of a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach. And I think that we're at a point now in this country, we really don't have room for reactive approaches anymore. We have to be proactive, okay? So, and especially Louisville, because there were a lot of plans in place for this city that are not gonna happen anymore. So it's kind of like, what is the plan going forward, and how do we make sure this is a plan that will stay in place for the long term, and that will have commitment, meaning that there's ownership of everybody at the table. And in my opinion, what's going on with these federal funding cuts, coupling with the alternative to the consent decree in Louisville, it really does pose a very unique opportunity for this community. And looking at the Bishop's Table, I'm sure you have other collaborative resources as well in the community to come together and start figuring this stuff out now, rather than waiting until next year, which I'm gonna tell you right now, once we kick into January next year, things are gonna be hardcore for everybody, okay? Everybody. Like, whatever you're hearing about in the news, maybe you're not feeling it, with the tariffs and inflation, you're gonna feel it in January, okay? So it's very important that we're more proactive rather than reactive and start doing the planning. So that's why I put out the one page. It's not gonna be some big report, right? Easy peasy, one page. Let's just go through the questions together and let's figure this out. Now we got something. Now we know you're responsible for that. It has to be getting done by this date and time. Boom, you have accountability, you have structure. That's how the sausage gets made. This is how we do things. And so, to me, that's something that going forward is going to need to happen. That I'm offering that resource. Like I said, it's free. Download it off the website. And if you're interested in having me do a teaching with you or workshop, you can always reach me. And I would love to do that virtually or in person.
Appreciate that offering, and a couple of things that I want to point out that you said, which is public safety is everything. It's housing, it's public transportation, it is everything. It's not a single issue. So we got to keep that in mind as well, have a holistic approach. I want to, before we close out, ask you to share any contact information you'd like to share with folks, because if they want to take you up on that offer, they need to know how to reach out to you. So if you could share your contact information with folks, and then we'll wrap up with the last question.
Okay, all right. And can I just highlight one last thing? If I just have just 2 more minutes. So one other thing I want to highlight with you is that there's a few things going on real quick. One is that when you look at the data around law enforcement killings, and so this is off of WashingtonPost.com, also mappingpoliceviolence.org. These are 2 different databases that have been collecting data on officer-involved killings of civilians ever since like 2015, I think, the Washington Post, and I think ever since 2013 or so with Mapping Police Violence. What they've shown from both databases is that, especially ever since 2020, the number of officer-involved deaths, meaning the number of civilians being killed by law enforcement, has gone up. And from 2015 till 2024, so that's when Biden and Harris were in the White House, and we had the DOJ doing all these kind of practice investigations and consent decrees. It was amazing, right? We had a 28% increase in officer-involved deaths from 2015 to 2024. Okay? So even when we have the consent decrees, we have the DOJ doing what they're supposed to do and doing it very well. I mean, very well. Okay? There's still something that's not working. There's still something that's like something under the surface that is not clicking to make sure that law enforcement are not using force when they don't need to. Okay? And in my opinion, I think that speaks to what's going on with having these authentic approaches rather than these model snapshot approaches. So I just want to highlight that's one thing. We are seeing an increase in officers using deadly force and people dying as a result of that. So that's one. Number two, something else to highlight is that now that the federal government is not involved, we do also have to consider the federal funding cuts and everything going on, that we're not going to have the resources to do the work the same way on finding solutions to these issues. And law enforcement now, any federal money they get, they are essentially told to not work with community members on moving forward on like 21st Century Policing Task Force report recommendations that President Barack Obama had put out. Like they're under federal, if they want to receive federal funding from the DOJ, they cannot move forward on those kinds of reforms. That's a condition now. So we have to understand, okay, the other thing we have to understand, this is the last point I want to raise with you, is that law enforcement, even before 2020, and definitely after 2020, has been struggling nationwide to hire, staff, and retain law enforcement officers, okay? I mean, it's just not popular to be a police officer since 2020. A lot of these young people, who usually are the people that they recruit, anytime they think about police, they think about George Floyd knee on the neck or Breonna Taylor. That's what they think about. So it's not appealing, it's not trending for them. We're not cool to be a police officer, okay? So they're really struggling on recruitment. So what that means is they're low, their capacity is lower across the country. So they're not able necessarily to respond to calls to service in a timely fashion. They may not have enough officers, on duty to respond to crimes, etc. So what they're doing, and as an alternative, instead of using the money to recruit and hire and retain officers, they're using that money to purchase surveillance technologies and services, like license plate readers, speed light cameras, red light cameras, gunshot detection technology like ShotSpotter, that's now called sound thinking. And now a big one, and this has become a huge trend with law enforcement agencies around the country, I'm sure here in Louisville as well, they're also purchasing and using unmanned drones. Okay, so these are like drones that have the rotating rotors on them, and they go up in the air, and they have cameras all over the place, and they see what you're doing, and that goes directly to the police feed. So now they have that video. Now the problem with this is that, okay, I'm not against using technology to address community safety issues. What I am against, and they're also incorporating artificial intelligence and facial recognition technology in these technologies. I'm going to put that out there too. What I am against is that we live in a democracy, all right? And at my opinion, that means if you're using that technology with my taxpayer dollars, I need to know what information are you collecting. I need to know how are you using that information? Who has access to that information? Are you selling it to anybody? Who are you selling it to? How are they going to use it? I need to know that because that's my information, okay? And I'm a taxpayer in this democracy, so I need that information. The problem is that even though we're seeing an explosion and expansion in the purchase and use of AI, facial recognition tech, all those other technologies I mentioned earlier, license plate readers, unmanned drones, etc., what we're not seeing an equal expansion of are getting federal, state, and local laws on the books to govern the purchase and use of them. Okay, this is democracy. We need the law to work. In order for it to work, it has to exist. If you don't have a law, then you're not able to get that information. And most importantly, you want to have a law that allows for community to be involved in the decision-making process from the beginning. Okay, police department, okay, parking enforcement, okay, parks and recs, okay, sanitation, because they're all doing it. You want to purchase an unmanned drone. Okay, well, we have a citizen advisory committee that has to work with the city council on making the decision on if that makes sense. Is there going to be any kind of violations of civil rights, civil liberties that we need to know in advance? What kind of technology are you using? Facial recognition tech, AI, how is it being used? All of that stuff, not only should the citizen advisory committee know about it and be able to weigh in on it, but it should also be made public. So that way the public can weigh in with public comment. Like I said earlier, this is democracy. Public comment is a big part of that. That's why we have the Open Meetings Act, right? And so being able to weigh in on the record once again means that, if they do move forward and purchase technology and we end up seeing those negative results, like violations of civil rights and civil liberties, because you had on the record said earlier, this is what will happen if we use it. This is why we shouldn't do it. And lawmakers were like, we're going to do it anyway. Well, guess what? Now, look at what happened. Look at what I said. You want to get reelected. I'm not supporting you, and I'm not going to tell other people to support you. And this is why. Bam. Okay? That's how democracy works. And so we have to be able to make sure that it's not only about getting a law on the books, locally, state, federal, that's a big question mark, but local and state you can have more influence over. But it's also what kind of law do you have? Is it allowing for taxpayers to be meaningfully involved in that process? All right, and one other thing I want to highlight is it's not only important to make sure that civilians are involved from the get-go, but even after the technology is purchased, you need to make sure that maybe the Inspector General's office here in Louisville, or your Civilian Complaint Review Board, there's a way for community members to file a complaint when they think the technology has been misused, okay? There's also the way for audits to be done regardless of a complaint, right? So there should be audits happening once every 3 months. And have an Inspector General do that, and at least once a year. And that audit should produce a report that is made public on the city's website that anybody in the world can access from anywhere in the world and see, okay, in this report, annual surveillance report, for every single agency in Louisville that is using surveillance technology for public safety purposes, okay, were there any complaints filed this year? Were there any violations of civil rights, civil liberties broken down by race, gender, age, location? Okay, those are the basic data sets that President Barack Obama's administration, the 21st Century Policing Task Force report, had said when you collect any data, you need those basic data sets, right? Race, gender, age, location. And then, in addition to that, how much money did it cost to purchase the technology that year? How much money does it cost to maintain and operate the technology that year? Because you want to know, are my taxpayer dollars being used the right way? And then lastly, you also want to know, going forward, was there any kind of disparate impact? In other words, did we see that as a result of this, certain communities, certain populations ended up having their rights violated, even if that was not the intention, right? So all of that needs to be in a report, made public, at least on an annual basis, so that people in the community can do that. And I just want to highlight with you, the last time I'm saying this, that work has already been done. So I actually work with community groups and local different leaders in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This was 5 years ago. I was brought in to help them make some changes. They already had a local law to govern the purchase and use of surveillance technology, but it wasn't strong. It didn't allow for community direct engagement, so that I made some changes to it, and then I negotiated with the city manager, the mayor, and the civilian oversight authority on getting that law not only finalized, but ultimately ratified. It was ratified. The majority of the recommendations I made were ratified into law about 3 years ago. So now, that local law has been in place for 3 years, and it's resulted, I'm gonna tell you right now, 2 annual surveillance reports that are made available to the public. You yourself, you can look it up, Grand Rapids Annual Surveillance Report. You can Google it, it will pop up, you can look at it, no matter where you are, and you can see how it's broken down, okay? So they now have 2 of them. They're about to publish a 3rd one before the end of this year, okay? And how many lawsuits? 0, okay? Why is that? Now, I just want to say, because it's not just about the what, it's about how you do things. You can't just create a law and say, hey, look, we did it, and not incorporate the directly impacted people. Like I said, the CAP method means we incorporate them into the process, okay? And so from the very beginning, from negotiation, through ratification, through implementation, directly impacted people have been involved in that law. And that's why there's no lawsuits, because you look at New York City, you look at Detroit, Michigan, they passed a similar law around a similar time period. They got lawsuits. Okay, why? Because it was more of that snapshot model kind of approach, not incorporating community members in an authentic, meaningful way. And so, like I said, the process reflects the outcome. If you have a process that's incorporating community, then that's what will be reflected in the outcome. If you don't, then you might end up with lawsuits.
Using license plate readers to track folks that they want to kidnap, or immigrants and refugees that they want to kidnap. So this is all. Have any question that you want to ask me?
Okay, yeah. Okay, now that you've heard everything that I've said, and I've responded to your questions, and I've given some examples of what's going on in other cities. What stands out to you, based on what I said, that you think is, I guess, right now, most pressing to move forward in the
Yeah. So I will say the community engagement, like real authentic community engagement. Y'all in the South, we say you can't keep putting lipstick on a pig and expecting change. We refer to lipstick quite a bit. We go on to say pig, and we mean that for everything. It's the community engagement. When things don't work in Louisville, when they don't work in Kentucky, when the legislature passes something, it's because we the people were not involved. We the people were not brought in. Maybe a few select individuals who basically go with the status quo, maybe engage, but not the people who are going to provide challenges, who are going to critique, who are going to say, no, I don't think so. So what I feel like Louisville can truly learn, particularly Louisville Metro Government, Louisville Metro Police Department, is engage with the people you don't like and who don't like you, because that's how change happens. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Ask Attica.
Yeah, can I just give my my contact information?
Yes.
Thank you. So if you'd like to reach out to me or be in touch with me about anything I discussed today, or just about anything related to law enforcement or public safety, community safety overall, you can reach me at my website. I don't know if the slide is up or the QR code and all that's there, but it's www.mayers, my last name, that's M like Mary, AYERS, and the word solutions.org. My email address is the word empower, EMPOWER, at mayorsolutions.org. And you can also reach me on Instagram, mayors_LLC, and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Mayors LLC. So, and the QR code is there if you wanted to scan it and go directly to my website. But all those resources are there. You just provide your email address, you get access to the one-pager and to the report card, decertification report card, and everything else. And you can always contact me and set up a consultation for me to just meet with you, and we can just talk as well. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Carlton Mayers, Esquire, for joining me on this episode of Ask Attica. Folks, we'll see you this evening at Roots 101. I know the flyer is up, but make sure that if you need to go back and rewatch to get a hold of that flyer, please do so. You can also check out Families United on social media for the flyer for more information. And of course, as always, thank you to Black Coffee and the Goodwill Opportunity Center for allowing us the privilege of being in this space, and to Stay Live Streams for producing the Ask Attica podcast. All right, y'all, we will see y'all on the other side of next week. So next week we'll probably take a break, and then we'll see you back in December. All right, take care.
I know people don't want to never in my career as a lawyer.
We have an attorney crisis.
Hey y'all, I'm Attica Scott, former Kentucky State Representative.
They're asking me about everything, local, state, federal, all the time. How do I do this? How do I do that? Why can't I get a speed hump? What's going on with the consent decree? Hey y'all. Welcome to Ask Attica. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful Friday